After without further ado, can I introduce Patsy, who will regale us with stories of Swindon and her growing up therein. Patsy.
Thank you, Ed. Have I got the volume right? Can you hear me all right? Yeah, not too loud. Okay. Trouble with being deaf is you tend to overproduce the volume, you know. So, yeah. Well, I was born in Swindon on the 29th of January, 1944. And the war was on, but I didn't know anything about that. I was my parents' much longed for child because my mother was 40, which in those days was seen as very old to have a child, the first child. And it was very exciting for my parents because they were the first generation in the family to own a house. They had actually watched our semi-detached house on the edge of Swindon going up, as they would describe it, brick by brick, but brick by brick. They used to go on walks in the evening to watch the house being built, and that was in 1936. It was built, and it was very precious to them. Had quite a nice garden, which they tended with passionate devotion. I never did like gardening after that, but they really did love it. um, anyway, so Dodmore Road was a quiet, select little road. There was no one opposite at all, except a field, and on the other side of the field was the canal, which was the old. Correct me if I'm wrong. I don't know. No, I don't know the name of the canal, but the canal that used to go through Swindon and was used. We still saw the odd barge when I was a child on the canal. And it connected quite heavy things, I imagine, to the railway works. You see, the railway works, Great Western Railway Works, was the real reason that well, it was called New Swindon initially, but it quickly came to be called Swindon. It was the reason it grew up tall, because originally there was a little market town on a hill called Swindon, swine town, and it's where the farmers locally came to sell the pigs. But when the railway was built, the Great Western Railway, the connection that came up from Bath and connected with London came across the quite flat plain around Swindon, and I guess it was a convenient place. You had to have people doing. Can you hear me all right without noise in the background? I'll shut the window if I need to. Yeah, they built a big railway works at Swindon, and that was where my father worked in an area called the Carriage and Wagon Works. My father was a fitter and toolmaker, which, if I understood it correctly, which I may well not have done, meant that he used to design the little bits and pieces and then actually build them that made the tools work. He used to talk about jigging up. I don't know if that means anything to anybody, but that's what he had to do. He had to design the bits and then build them, and then they used to go forward. So it was quite a complicated job, I think. He worked awfully long hours. He would be off on his bike at 7:15 every morning, and you would hear a hooter going off, and all of a sudden, all the streets of Swindon would be black with bicycles, with all the men racing down to the Great Western Railway Works because it was the big employer all the time I was growing up. Although Plessy built somewhere, and I think there was one other employer that I forget that came while I was growing up. But really, it was the Works, as it was called, that was the place in Swindon, I think. So that was when my dad worked. He used to go off early. He'd come back about, I don't know now, I remember it as 5:30, it may not have been. And he'd get washed and changed. He'd put on his suit and he'd go off to do his second job. And his second job was he was the local secretary for something called, oh no, well, I must get this right, the Wiltshire Working Men's Benefit Society. and this existed so that the men could pay in a small amount of money every month, and this then paid their money when they were sick. Graham, did you want to ask something? Sorry, did you put your hand up? Yeah. You're muted. I can't tell if Graham's asking a question or not. No? No, okay. I'll carry on. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end as well, so don't worry. Yeah, so he had two jobs. Because of this, I think probably we had a good deal better standard of living than otherwise might have been expected. 6 Dubmore Road was a little semi-detached house, a 3-bedroom house though, the 3rd bedroom being very small, and there were just the 3 of us living in it. And it was a really big deal to my parents to own a house. It hadn't happened before in the family. It did happen at much the same time. My mother's sister, who will come into the story shortly, my mother's sister also acquired a house just up the road on something called the Drove Road that goes right the way through Swindon, called different things at different places. And it's where they used to obviously drive the animals. That was, I don't know, I think their home went away. It was like their big thing, their home and their garden. And then, the capital, I arrived, quite unexpectedly, I gather, and an only child throughout. So I don't know what you think about that, but I've often thought it isn't terribly good for the personality. But I got over this bad start in that respect later on. My earliest memory is the snow. I'm sure I ought to remember things before this, but I mean the snow of 1947, because I know I wasn't tall, because standing on the carpet in our front room, I could see they got this sort of privet box hedge around the front garden, tended with loving care, and it was covered with snow. And I remember looking at that and just marveling, really. And then also, I'm pretty sure it was 1947. I was 3. I'd been shopping with my mother, and we were calling at Auntie Jay's. This is the auntie who lived around the corner that I mentioned just now. Mother had bought her a lardy cake, and she dropped the lardy cake. Together, she was carrying all the shopping, and she dropped the lardy cake, and it froze to the ground, and we couldn't get it up. It was that cold that a larder cake froze to the ground. So that's how come I'm quite sure of, or pretty sure of which year it was. My Auntie Jay was my favourite person. I didn't know my grandparents, so Auntie Jay stood in. She was older than my mother, and she thought I was wonderful, and she always had sweets for me. As I got older, money as well. And she had a daughter herself called June. June was 13 years older than me. June comes into my life story much later on, because June was the person who owned Bonnie, the dog that became my support dog, who most of you have met. But that was many years later, and when she was 13, June didn't like me very much because I was noisy and spoilt and really unpleasant for a 13-year-old girl to be around. Well, when I was, my mother taught me at home until I was 4, and then I had to go to school. I didn't like it much at all. In fact, I didn't like it one little bit. It had these railings around the playground, and I remember my mother, who really needed some counselling, bringing me little sandwiches and pushing them to me through the railings to cheer me up. It just fills me with horror now, and I think, what a mad thing to do. But we do mad things with love, don't we? But it wasn't the right thing to do. And I remember standing. It was, I don't know. We were all small. This was an infant school, so it went up to age 7. It would be called something posher nowadays, I dare say, but it was called the infant in those days. And the whole school, all 3 years of us, had to stand together in the main hall every morning and chant all of our tables, right the way through to 12. So all of our, of course, when you're 4 and you've just arrived, this doesn't actually mean a great deal to you. However, I'm happy to say that I retain all my tables perfectly to this day. So that to the educationalist, because I hadn't a clue what I was learning. But later on, I was able to pull it out of memory box and use it to great effect. So I forgive them for chanting the tables. But I didn't like it there at all. And I was happy when at 7, I was able to go to the junior school. Junior school was a big change. I went on my own after the first day. It was about, well, it used to take me about half an hour, I dare say. But anyway, at 7, it took me half an hour to walk to junior school. It was a big old-fashioned building, again, very high ceilings, chanting tables kept up. The most significant thing I remember was that there were 2 doorways. One said boys and one said girls. And I remember standing over out on the pavement thinking, which one do I go in? Which I think is interesting because it wasn't I couldn't spell. I hadn't got the concept of boys and girls. I hadn't picked it up, so which I think is quite interesting, really. Again, really bad, I think, sociologically. It was really quite big. There were 5 classes, A, B, C, D, and E. And sure enough, A was for the smarter children, and E was for the children who were more intellectually challenged. And they used to line us all up on the playground so you could see which ones were in A and which were in B and which were in C and D and E. E was quite a small group. And one thing, I didn't really have much of a concept. I didn't have any concept of social class, I don't think, but I did notice that the children in the E group had got very poor clothing. Some of them were barely dressed at all, really, whereas I, of course, was in smart new clothes, specially purchased by my mother for the occasion, as were most of the children in the A class. So it didn't take us long to pick up that, of course, as we were in the A class, we were obviously the best children. Makes you really want to go back, doesn't it, and rewrite history, but there's nothing to be done about that. But I do think it was a really horrible introduction to society and quite damaging, really. Very formal learning also there. Not just chanting tables, spelling, having to go out and spell things on the blackboard. Well, I was good at that, but for some children it was horrible because they were definitely laughed at if they couldn't do it, and teased, and by the teacher as well as the pupils. And I think that they saw that as a method of making us work harder. I'm sure they did, but I think for some children it must have been devastating. So that was me right up until I was 11 years old in these really rather large classrooms. 45 of us there were in my class, which is a big class. And guess what? The smarter children ended up down the front. Don't you think that's interesting? The kids who were doing best were at the front, and the ones who were not doing so well were at the back. Which means that they had an even worse chance than had they. Yeah. Anyway, I at the time, I'm afraid I didn't see anything much to it, but I did think later on that I thought that was really bad. Anyway, it comes to the 11 plus, and I didn't really know what it was all about, except my parents thought it was extremely important. But there wasn't much they could do about it, except make sure I turned up. Because, well, frankly, as I remember it, that examination made no sense to me whatsoever. I don't think it would today either. It was an intelligence test. It was there to measure my intelligence, and I just tackled it as best I could. And I must have done all right because I was one of the 21 children out of the 45 and out of the whole school who got to grammar school. So, but I just think that's awful because that was a big school which was actually in the centre of Swindon. I had to walk in, I just think anyway. So anyway, hang on. I'll just I wrote my notes on these big pages to make sure that I didn't run out of time because I'm very bad at timekeeping. I wanted to say something about our garden. Because it was my parents' pride and joy. They'd never had a garden before, you see, and it was effectively at the bottom of it was an allotment where they grew all our vegetables, and there was a lawn which my father tended with great care, and I wasn't allowed to do all the exciting things I wanted to do on. And he had a Charles Ross apple tree, which did produce very nice apples sometimes. And I had a swing. I was, you know, I was very well looked after. You know, I couldn't have been given more, you know, the things that children like to have, really, considering they didn't really have a big income, but they definitely made me and the garden the the centre of their lives, and they spent what they did get on the two of us, me and the garden. I also think I got the sweet ration for the entire family. So I was, this is a very important thing to say because get back now to the 11 plus and going to grammar school. And it was very emphasised by the grammar school that we all had to have school uniform, and school uniform had to come from Daniel Neal's. So Daniel Neal's put on a sort of show of all the clothes at the school. And guess what? Nothing fitted me. And this, I think, had something to do with the fact that I had had everybody else's sweet ration for years and nobody said anything. You know, nobody said, gosh, she's a bit fat, isn't she? Well, they may have done, but I didn't know, you know. And there was nothing that would fit me. So we had to do, it was very exciting, actually. The humiliation came later. At the time, it was exciting. We did a trip to London. We could travel on the train free sometimes in the year because of my dad's job on the works. And so we went up to London and we got the underground out to, Golders Green, which was where the headquarters of Daniel Neal's was. And they made up my clothes separate, you know, specially. It must have cost a fortune. But nobody told me that, but you know, common sense makes me think so. And off I go to the grammar school. They put me at the top form, which presumably meant I did okay in the 11 class. But I did very badly in my first year because I was so wretched. I got laughed at all the time because I was about twice the size of all the other children in the class. I think some of them actually were undernourished. I think, and they grew up bigger later. But at that time, I'd been well nourished and I was overweight, very overweight. And I was just a laughing stock. And it was terrible. And before the second year, I was told that I wasn't working hard enough. My work wasn't good enough. I was going to have to go down. You know, I was going to go down. I mean, it was one of the worst phrases they would produce. You know, you could go up and that was good. You could go down and that was bad. So I was going to go down. And the reason my parents were very upset about this was the fact that if you went down, you didn't do Latin. Latin was just for the people in the top streams, the two top streams, U and A. And if you weren't in one of those, you didn't do Latin. And at the time, if you didn't do Latin, you couldn't get into a university to do English. English was my best subject. So my father got what was called a pass out. I think it means you went through the gates, but you didn't get paid while you were out from the works. I went to see the headmaster. And I don't know what he said, but anyway, I got moved. I did go down, I didn't stay in the top stream, but I went into a sort of removed class where I was able to continue Latin, which incidentally couldn't have been less relevant when it did come to going to university, but none of us knew that then. So he had to do that, and that was really embarrassing. And meanwhile, I was desperately unhappy because everybody laughed at me. However, I had an inspiration, and I did several things to help myself. I have been quite good at helping myself in my life, but in the end, it sometimes takes me a long time to get there. It took me a year in this case. First thing I did was I made my parents' life a misery until they gave me a bicycle. Uh, they didn't want me to have a bicycle. It was much safer than it is nowadays, although nobody wore helmets or anything like that. But there was so much less, motor traffic on the road. But they still didn't want their only child navigating the roundabouts and so on. But anyway, I kept on until I got it. And then I told them I was having school meals, school lunches. But in fact, I didn't have the school lunches at all. So I cycled to school, did a day's work at school, cycled home again, and persuaded them I could have Rivitas for tea because I'd already had a school lunch, which I hadn't. And guess what? The weight came off really quickly. The school was 3.5 miles away, so that was 7 miles a day cycling on not very much food. And I did get rid of the fatness quite quickly. It has, I'm afraid, left me with a tendency, though, to put fat on really easily all my life. So I think those fat cells are still just sitting there. And I've only really got to look at a donut and bang, Anyway, so there was my dieting. And the other thing I did to make myself popular is I became really good at poking fun at people. I mean, I was very funny, I think, but I'm sure that this was very cruel, because I think one of the things that happens is if people have made fun of you, you think that's I don't know. I think you copy it, and I used to make fun of other people, and including the teachers, and I became really quite popular. Horrible, isn't it? But so that was the bad thing I did to make myself a happier person. And after that, I kind of settled down like an ordinary child, and sort of mixed with the mob more. And I worked really hard at school, but I was never really popular. I never had a crowd of friends like some children did. I think it might be something to do with the fact I was quite a long way from the school, so there was no one living near me that went to the school at all. So I only saw the children at school, when I actually went there. I think things improved for me a bit in that respect when I was about 16. And we had these school dances, which were frankly a misery. Coming up to Christmas every year, we had these lessons. They would teach us the quick step and the waltz and all these other dances that nobody does anymore. And then we would have to perform them for each other at something called, we referred to it as the soiree. And it was years before I discovered that what this was a soiree. But anyway, we all called it a soiree. And it was the first thing I heard of it was, who's going to take you to the soiree? And I thought, what? I had no idea. I had totally missed out on this idea that anyone had to take me anywhere. I just didn't have it in here because I hadn't mixed much outside school with other children my own age. I didn't realize that boys took girls out. Boys took girls to the cinema and to the soiree. Well, sad to relate, for the first 4 years of being at grammar school, nobody asked me to the soiree at all. And it was dreadful, because my parents would buy me a lovely party dress. And all the girls sat on one side of the room, all the boys sat on the other. At a given signal, the boys got up and came over and picked a girl. Nobody ever picked me. I just sat there. It was dreadful. I mean, of course, the first year I did look huge, so of course they didn't pick me, But after that, it somehow I never caught on. And then luckily, one year, I think it was my 5th year, it may have been my 4th year, a boy came and asked me to dance. I was so pleased. I thought it was absolutely wonderful. The said boy became a really good friend, and in the end, we did actually get married, but that was many years later. Um, well, a few years later, actually, not many years, but I didn't know that was going to happen. So it did. Really, our lives from the age of 16 onwards were centered on trying to get to university. And in fact, I've made a note of this. What was it? Oh, I haven't written the number down. I know I wrote it somewhere. No, I have to do it from memory. Of those of us that stayed to sixth form, and lots of people, including my best friend Shirley, didn't. Shirley got a job in the civil service, which took you at 16. She said she didn't want to go to university because she'd have to wear flat shoes and people would laugh at her, and she'd always have to carry books, so she didn't want to do that. Shirley joined the civil service. She did extremely well and married a man from the civil service. And the last time I heard of them, they were living in Basingstoke. She was happy. So that was Shirley, and there were about, how many of us on the what would now be called the arts side? There were half a dozen of us who were aiming at university. Only one was prepared to stay on 3 years in the sixth form and try for Oxbridge. I actually tried for Oxbridge anyway, but I got an interview, but I wasn't accepted. So I went to Birmingham University when I was 18. The last 2 years at school weren't too bad really, because so long as we turned up for the key sessions, we could skive off quite a lot. And there was a really good pub opposite the school gates called the Moonraker, or the Moonies, and a lot of us could be found in the Moonies some of the time. I don't know. I don't know if the teachers knew and didn't say anything, or what really. So yeah, sixth form was more fun because I had a boyfriend. I mean, this was it, social status. If you had a boyfriend, if you didn't have a boyfriend, you were just nothing. In the scheme of things, you didn't get invited to anything. And gender wasn't a topic that got discussed. I mean, like not at all. I mean, as far as I knew, if you wanted a relationship, which in those days I think it could be called sentimental or romantic relationship, as opposed to the word we now say, which is sexual, it was a boy. I didn't know that there was anything else. With hindsight, having decided that I was going much later, I didn't know until I was in my 20s that there was such a thing as being a lesbian. I didn't know. The only clue I can offer to the world is the fact that we had to cover all our exercise books in school with brown paper. Everybody used to draw on them, and mine were covered in drawings of women. I mean, just the top. This was their head and shoulders, but it was, that's all I drew. That was what I thought was beautiful, so that's what I drew. And that was the only kind of clue which was available to a historian as to how come Patsy Staddon didn't realise she was a lesbian earlier. I'd never heard of it. Didn't know. Never heard of it. Sorry. And I was friends with this nice boy, so we got closer and more intimate as time went on. And I didn't know that there was anything missing from my life in that respect at that time. I think some of this may have been to do with my favourite subject, which is social class, because I do think that girls I later met at university of a higher social class did have a very good idea, but I'd never heard of it, and I hadn't heard, of girls having relationships with each other or boys having relationships with each other. And there you go, really. I guess I read the wrong books. Well, that was as far as I was going to go to today, because that by now I'm 18. I'm leaving Swindon. Yeah, I'm leaving. I hated Swindon. I really did. I felt I was in a cage, and I was really looking forward to hitting the streets of Birmingham. So that's the end of my introductory talk, which I could take up at a future date. But I think actually a lot of it I covered talking to you about the rest of my life on other occasions. It was just the growing up bit that I don't think I have talked about. Okay, I am happy to answer questions if there are any. Hey, I got the timing right. Do you realise it's 11:35, which means that I did it. I spoke for half an hour without drying up, but without overrunning, and it was an accident.
That's a lot of that, the growing up bit, I can recognise with my own life in that type of thing, you know. But my my growing up was in a council house rather than in that type of thing, you know. And I would have thought it was quite rare for you were quite one of the standout children if your parents had a house of their own. It was one of those things, you know. But yeah, you spoke about hooters sounding, and they were part of my growing up life as well, because there was a gasworks behind where I lived, and at 7 o'clock in the morning you would hear this hooter going, and it was also the phase that I had to get up and have breakfast and get ready to go to school, you know, that type of thing. So rather like you, my life was generated by the sounds of outdoor life, you know, that type of thing. So I thought, yeah, I remember that as well.
Well, we had less clocks and watches too. You know, the hooters were important. There was one at 7:25, and that was like a last warning to the men. And then 7:30 meant that's it, you're locked out. And they were locked out. They couldn't work until, I don't know, I think it was 7:45. But yeah, but there weren't so many clocks in places, I don't think, and certainly not watches. Watches were a bigger thing, weren't they?
Yeah, I remember reading another life of someone of that type of thing, and they said that there'd be a hooter going, and because it was in the factories, they would hear people going down the cobbled roads in the sound of their shoes, you know, with the metal bits on their shoes. So the sound of people clacking down the road, type of thing, you know, you think, yeah, that's about that type of thing, you know. And Swindon is becoming became quite big for the railway, didn't it? You know, in that.
Yes, it was its thing, you know, but then it really started to expand with overflow from London while I was growing up, and my road, which had fields and a canal, became other buildings, and the canal became something called Queen's Way, which is an important road that runs right the way through Swindon. It takes you out to the suburbs. Well, they're not even suburbs anymore. And where I grew up is now called Old Walcott, whereas it was the Walcott estate. I think the Walcotts were a local family, but of repute, and presumably sold the land. But you know, when I was a child, you could walk out into fields.
Have you been back to Swindon when you were a lot older and saw the difference between the
Well, yes, because you see, there was June, whereas June didn't like me. You know, that was my cousin who was 13 when I was born. She didn't like me then, but obviously we had a huge amount in common, you know, about family background. And slowly everybody else died off. And in the end, there was just me and June. By then, I was living in Bristol and she was living in Swindon. And she was actually by then the only person I knew in Swindon. But I used to go up on the train about once a month to see her. Which is how I got to know Bonnie. I fell in love with Bonnie on sight. I said, you know, you must always make sure that I get Bonnie when you die. So, but no, I mean, June was ever so important. I missed June dreadfully. because she was my only link with the past, because of all the things that went wrong at one point in my life. I lost all my links with Swindon. You know, the friends that I'd retained that belonged kind of with me and my husband, they all left their friendship with me and became friends of him and didn't want anything to do with me. People don't believe that alcoholics recover. They just didn't want to get involved with an alcoholic. It wasn't just that either. I mean, it's not just being an alcoholic, it's all dreadful things you do that they didn't want to be involved with. They would have felt they couldn't trust me, I'm sure. So June was all I had left, really. And it was really, so the trips to Swindon to see June were important. And yeah, Swindon really developed. I mean, opposite June was what had been the gravel pit had been opposite June. And by the time I was going up to see June and Bonnie, it became this beautiful garden, Queen's Park, on lots of levels with a lake and swans. It was absolutely gorgeous. And Swindon did really well with the gravel pits. And it was also, I don't know what the rates are like in Swindon, but it hugely expanded. I mean, out from where I used to live, and which was on the very edge of Swindon. I don't know. I think there are at least 3 big housing estates now between them and Coatwater, which is an area of very, very popular with wildfowl on the edge of Swindon. Again, it was really scruffy and down at heel when I lived there, but now it's, wow, is it upmarketed, you know. So Swindon's done well with its open spaces, but it remains, I have to say, I find it a very depressing town. It's still, I would say, I find it depressing, even though it's got those lovely spaces on the edge. Yeah, I don't know. Perhaps it's just childhood memories, you know. It just make me think. I mean, it always felt grey somehow. I think it's because I don't know what I've missed out that I was going to talk about. Can I pop it in here? You see, I did. I was so fortunate because my dad worked on the railway, and we had these free passes. Not all the time, but so many a year, you know. And so every summer, we went away for a week to Weymouth, which was, you know, it was just amazing. We looked forward to it all the year, all the other 51 weeks we were counting. I still do it, you know. I've just come back from the seaside and I started counting now. It's not something you get over, really. I just love the sea very much. And obviously we went on the train, and they would put on special trains to Weymouth and to Weston from Swindon, and they were packed. You know, I mean, you saw all your neighbours in Weymouth or Weston, depending on which one they chose. They could go to other places, but mostly they didn't because they were relatively short journeys. They would put on special trains which went directly from Swindon to Weymouth, for example. So you didn't have to change at Southampton or anything like that. And we would stay nowhere posh. It was in a boarding house. So we just had one room for the 3 of us, shared bathroom with lots of other families, communal breakfast around a table, very formalised. I think it was quite frightening to people who didn't normally eat out or anything like that. We were all very anxious to do the right thing, you know, pick up the right spoons and forks. You know, I remember that as being really frightening because my parents were so anxious that I wouldn't make a mistake. But once we were out, and then when you left the boarding house, you had to take with you absolutely everything you needed for the day because you weren't let back in until, I think it was 6 o'clock. So my dad was always the one. Occasionally you got somebody photograph you. We didn't have a camera. You know, on the pier and on the promenade, there'd be somebody to take pictures, the holiday makers. And all the pictures of me and my mum and my dad was carrying this big, he used to joke about it. He was always carrying this big bag. His holiday consisted of carrying a big bag which had our raincoats, something to drink, sandwiches for lunch, which my mother had to make up in the communal kitchen, because we didn't have enough money to buy food out. So we'd had to, anything we wanted to eat in the day, we had to take with us. And sometimes, of course, it rained, and there we'd be sitting inside those like bus shelters, you know, which luckily there were plenty, and we might have to eat our sandwiches there. So that was the day, really. It was very carefully delineated between finishing breakfast at the boarding house, and then going back to tea. If you missed it, you'd had it at the boarding house. And then we used to go out for a walk, usually in the evening. I don't know if he still had to carry the bag or not. But anyway, at least I was one of the lucky children to have such a holiday, because many children didn't have a holiday at all. And I was made very aware of that. And in fact, I was aware of it, you know, from an early age. I knew I was really lucky about holidays. I don't know about anything else. I think everything else I was lucky about, I took for granted, but not the holidays. I knew I was lucky because I knew there were only a handful of children I knew who were able to actually go away to stay. They went on day trips, but not to stay. So it was a very important part of my life. And then when I was 9 years old, my parents thought I was old enough for the big adventure, and that was the overnight train to Cornwall. And we then started going to Penzance, which I thought was wonderful. And I've always loved Cornwall after that. I think I better shut up. But anyway, so that was the bit I missed out.
Yes, I grew up in Eastbourne in Sussex, which used to have lots of tourists come down during the summer season. So you'd always see the tourists on the prom, and if it was rainy, as you say, in the little shelters,
packed,
you know, with their rain mats and
plastic hoods.
Yeah, I remember it well. Yes, and there was the bandstand.
Yes. Oh yes. I still really enjoy listening to bands, you know. I absolutely love bands, you know, silver bands or brass bands, you know, because they remind me of childhood, you know.
Oh, yeah, very much so. Yeah. Yes, we were children of those times.
Yeah.
And I'm sure Graham was also.
Yes.
Yes, I'm a bit earlier than you, Patsy, but thank you for your talk and reminding me of the stages I went through. The railings around the infant school. I wasn't fed through them, but I did walk out of school on one occasion at the age of 5 and walked home, crossing over the busy Wells Road. Fortunately, my mother was in, so I was accepted. And before long, 2 teachers came from the school. I had been missed, and there was a great consternation that as a new child in reception at this school, I was unhappy and wanted to be home. The fact was, although I couldn't explain it, I just thought that when the bell went, that was the end of school and it was time to go home. So I opened the gate and walked out. And then the transfer to junior school and the 11 plus, which I didn't recognize the importance of at the time. It was just another sort of test one had to do. Holidays during the war, holidays by train, and seeing all the family provisions packed into a trunk standing in the hall. And then on arrival at the boarding house, there was the trunk. We hadn't taken it. It had just disappeared and reappeared where we wanted it. The winter of 1947, ice everywhere in Bristol, and it went on and on and on.
Mm. Yeah.
And then grammar school and so on, and the pressure to get to university. And
Mm.
in the case of Bristol Grammar School, university meant Oxford or Cambridge. Nothing else really counted.
Mm.
So I was a failure in the end.
Mm.
But yeah, interesting times. Rationing.
Yeah.
The freedom I had,
Mm.
being able to walk, not as far as you, but walking on my own to junior school and back, and then later on cycling from Knoll across to Clifton to Bristol Grammar School
Mm.
on my own in traffic, and
Mm.
it was just accepted that
Mm.
you learned how to survive by actually experiencing it, rather than being ferried around in someone's car. Very interesting. Times have changed, not in every respect for the better.
No, no, no. I try not to get irritated with the carrying of children to school. You know, I just want to scream. You know, stick them on the bikes. You know, because the thing is, if they did, there'd be less cars on the road, so it would be safer. But oh well. I don't say that to my daughter. I've one of my daughters has got a daughter, and he's ferried everywhere. And so, admittedly, this is in London, but even so.
Yes, I'm. You reminded me of a memory I don't have, which I'm very grateful that I don't, because one of our holidays, I mean, we had a car, but it was bed and breakfast. And for the whole fortnight, it rained. So we were leaving at 9 o'clock in the morning, getting back at 6, and spending the rest of the day in the car most of the time. But fortunately, I've got no memory of it. So, you know, it may be that the trauma's buried really deeply, or, you know, I've just slowed it off. But
well, in the situation where with holidays we were concerned, you know, with my family, it was basically a non-starter because there were 6 of us. You know, so the you know, it was not going away because, you know, they couldn't afford it really, you know. But we had being Eastbourne, we had I and my brothers had, you know, the seaside, the South Downs, and that type of thing, you know. So you just went out all day and came back in the evening, type of thing, you know. And you know, if you came back early, you know, it was kind of, why are you back? What's gone wrong? You know, type of thing, you know. Yeah, go out again. Go on. Scramooch, type of thing, you know. And that was, as you folks are saying, it was a different time when you were much more confident, when you were able to go out and do these type of things. And I suppose it's the fact that I was with my brothers and there were kind of 3 other brothers. And so we were kind of in a little group, you know, and nobody would bother with 4 smelly individuals like us, you know. So it's quite the thing, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah,
people do worry more. They do seem to worry a lot about child safety.
No, I certainly walked to and from school all the time on my own.
I mean, we were, well, I mean, I was told not to speak to, what was it? Strange men, I think was the phrase. Not to speak to strange men, but there weren't any, you know.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a problem. Well, I don't know. But really, I didn't. You know, I remember the walk to school as being very solitary.
Yeah.
I didn't meet other children walking along because I was the only child in my area of school age. So I didn't meet anybody until I was quite near the school gates, even though it was quite a long walk.
So those strange women were okay, was it?
Well, they weren't mentioned.
No.
Invisible. No, I mean, it wouldn't happen today. But
Yes,
but I do think. I mean, I'm glad I had the childhood I had. I'm glad I had the freedom to do that walking and those experiences. And I don't envy children who do get ferried around all the time because they're like they're in a box. And I don't think, you know, their lives are less rich. I'm not even sure that their lives are safer. I know they're supposed to be, but I'm not sure.
Yes, I can remember being young and we weren't allowed to ride our bikes on the road. So of course we never, you know, learnt to ride them properly. And I can remember when I was in my teens, I wanted a motorbike. My father had one, you know, and they'd had one, you know, early married life, sidecar and this sort of thing, but no, too dangerous, you know. Which is, I think, a pity, you know. We've got to, take risks with your children.
Yes. Yeah, you know, and you know, I wasn't allowed to do things like climb trees. I wasn't even allowed to climb our own apple tree. This was because my father's apples were so precious, and I mean, fair enough too. He only had one or two, so you can understand this, you know. But I've just seen Hattie.
Yeah.
That's right. There's a sign which says, tis hello.
Hello.
Nice to see you.
Great, I've just arrived. What have I missed?
Right, well,
About an hour's worth.
It'll be taped, won't it? It'll be recorded.